Good evening. I'm Serena Oberstein, Executive Director of Jewish World Watch. Rooted in our own experiences of persecution, Jewish values, and tradition, we were founded in 2004 when the silence about the genocide in Darfur was deafening. 16 years later, genocide and mass atrocity are still rampant, but we are not helpless in this fight. Jewish World Watch compels and enables people to stand up and take action through advocacy, education, and direct aid to combat mass atrocity worldwide. I want to welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for the last of our coalition conversations. Tonight, we'll focus on addressing trauma, examining the importance of providing multi-pronged mechanisms for wholeness and healing. Tonight's conversation is part of Impact in Action, a month of events focused on raising our collective voice to fight genocide. It's being produced in partnership with the Center for the Study of Law and Genocide at LMU Loyola Law School, USC's Shoah Foundation, and UCLA's Promise Institute to discuss the importance of preserving survivor testimony, reconciliation, and rebuilding livelihoods. Tonight, we'll discuss the complexity of facing trauma and when it occurs as a result of broken infrastructure or at the hands of those in power, and how we come together to collectively repair our community. I want to thank our illustrious panelists, Leslie Gilbert-Lurie, Genea Richardson, Ruth Beaglehole, Katie J. Scott, and our moderator, Naama Haviv. I also want to thank our Global Vision sponsors, Lawrence and Jane Z. Cohen and the Goldrich Foundation. We hope that you'll join us for more events throughout the month of Impact in Action, and then we hope you'll be compelled to take action. Our dynamic moderator, Naama Haviv, is Mazon's Director of Community Engagement and brings more than a decade of experience in social justice advocacy, coalition building, and international development. Prior to joining Mazon, she served as Executive Director of Pansy Foundation USA, supporting its mission to end sexual violence against women in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and provide holistic healing services to its survivors. Naama also served as Assistant Director at Jewish World Watch, where she directed policy, programming, and partnerships. She has created and managed educational programs for Relief International, connecting students from the US to students in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Tajikistan, and the West Bank. And she held research positions with the Institute for the Study of Genocide, the Middle East Media Research Institute, and the American Anti-Slavery Group. Naama is brilliant, a person of true integrity, and someone who lives her values every day. In her spare time, she curates a museum in Northeast LA called The Tiny. If you haven't yet, go check it out. We're truly honored to have her guide us through this conversation today. Thanks so much, Naama.
Thank you, Serena. That was such a lovely introduction. I am so thrilled to be here and to be here with all of you. I was truly excited when Serena invited me to join this conversation tonight because I know from my experience working both internationally and domestically that while a specific experience of trauma may be individual, its implications can have ripples at the communal, societal, and even global level. So I'm really excited to explore this issue with all of you tonight. Thank you for having me. I'm also really excited to share this evening with 4 incredible women. I'm going to do some very quick introductions of each of our panelists, but we'll drop the full bios in the chat, so you should check everybody out. We're going to start this evening with Leslie Gilbert-Lurie, who is an accomplished lawyer, human rights and children's rights advocate, an author, a philanthropist, and a former television executive, just to add a little bit extra in there. As the child of a Holocaust survivor, Leslie has a truly unique perspective on intergenerational experiences and transmissions of trauma. As Healing Dialogue and Actions Inside Program Coordinator, Genea Richardson is an expert on moving forward through trauma because she has not only done so herself, but she's used her experience to help other women repair, restore, and rebuild. Formerly incarcerated herself, Genea has dedicated her life to seeking healing for both survivors and perpetrators of violent crime by opening up dialogues and finding common ground for processing trauma. Next, I'm happy to introduce Ruth Beaglehole, who has been a tireless advocate for an end to violence and oppression of children for more than 50 years, dedicated to educating parents, caregivers, and professionals in the practice of parenting with nonviolence. This work has taken her all around the world, world, and even to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where she worked directly with Congolese parents whose children were engaged in a Jewish World Watch supported educational program. And finally, Katie J. Scott Starring is the executive director of IACT, a longtime partner, collaborator, and often co-conspirator with Jewish World Watch, a trainer, an educator, and a powerful practitioner of transformative justice. Katie J's leadership has expanded IACT's trauma-informed programming across the globe, working with refugee populations in Chad, Tanzania, Cameroon, Greece, and more. So I think we can get started. Ladies, you each experienced trauma from different perspectives as children, as survivors, as practitioners, and as educators. I'd like to start us off by asking each of you to just share a couple of minutes about your experience, how you come to your work in overcoming, recovering from, and preventing trauma. Leslie, can you start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much, Naama, for your great introductions, and to this coalition for putting on such an interesting group of panels. I'm honored to serve on this panel and to be part of this important conversation about trauma and healing. My experience writing a memoir about my mother's life and its impact on me, and then my daughter, has shed the first light on this issue for me. My mother spent 2 years from the ages of 5 to 7 hiding in a farmhouse attic in Poland with 14 members of her family. During that time, her younger brother and her mother died in hiding from some combination of illness and lack of nutrition and who knows what else. After the war, my mother spent a year in a hospital in Italy. She had tuberculosis and rickets, and then she spent several years traveling from displaced persons camp to displaced persons camp with her family in Europe, waiting for some country to admit her family. She came to the United States at the age of 12. She didn't speak a word of English, and she had never been to school. When she graduated from high school at the age of 17, she experienced extreme depression, never having adequately dealt with all of the sadness and trauma she had experienced as a young child. She told her father about this. He said, "You're not crazy, you don't need a psychiatrist," but she knew that she needed help. And against his will, she got help. Her depression ultimately receded, and she felt herself, as she said, bending toward the sun. That's how we got the title of our memoir. And when my mother was 22, I was born. And although I was a fairly normal child, I felt different from many of the other children I knew. I was extremely anxious about being apart from my mother. I felt a lot of guilt for having so many of the things that she had never had, like birthday parties and a mom. And I had nightmares, and I was hyper vigilant, in constant lookout for the next tragedy, on constant lookout for the next tragedy. I did manage to grow up, in part due to my father and his less dramatic childhood, and in large part due to my mother also. I became a lawyer and then a television executive, a community leader of sorts. And when I got married and had children, I was sure that they would not experience what I had experienced. I was sure that I would be a buffer, my husband would be a buffer between my mother and my children. So I was surprised when my daughter, in particular, experienced many of the same fears that I had had. And when we wrote our book, when we wrote our memoir, and I learned more about intergenerational trauma, I realized that I had underestimated the resiliency of one generation's trauma being passed down to the next and the next. Our memoir became a 3-generation memoir of how trauma gets transmitted from generation to generation. Since then, I have sought to learn more, and particularly want to learn more about how to heal those effects. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Genea, I think you're next.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I've experienced trauma firsthand during my incarceration. When I was incarcerated in a women's prison, I was there 18 years. I saw firsthand what trauma can do to people and the effects of trauma during my incarceration. So when you're incarcerated, there's two choices you can make. You can try to survive, or you can fall into that place and let it pretty much take your soul. So I chose to be a light in there by the grace of God. I saw that in small acts, like seeing people, sharing a cup of coffee with people, listening to people, was a way of healing. It not only helped me heal from my own trauma, but it helped to heal other people. Because in a place of darkness, all we need is a little light. We just need to see each other as human beings. We need to know that someone cares about us despite where we are or what happened in our lives. So that had dictated my time. I would do small things like one time I met a roommate and she was completely deaf. And I just simply learned sign language because I saw that she was angry. I saw that she felt ostracized because you have all these people having conversations and she doesn't understand what's going on. So I simply learned sign language so that I can communicate with her and include her. And I saw how that small act, it blossomed her, it opened her up, and it brought out a different side of her because she was able to begin to relate to people by talking just through communication. So those are things that motivated me. Also, the trauma that my mother has faced in her life, being in and out of mental hospitals and feeling suicidal and different things like that. I saw that my incarceration also affected her and different people in my lives. So I am dedicated and motivated to continuing to show the world that people that's incarcerated, they matter, they have a story, and they need help too. So I'm writing curriculum and I'm sending it back into the prisons to help women heal by implementing certain tools. Pretty much the bottom line is showing them that we care, that people out here care, and these are things that I have done in my life that helped me heal. So I'm reaching out and sharing them with other people. So that is why I'm dedicated to doing what I do today, and I'll pass it on.
Yeah, that's so moving. And I'm struck in particular by the value that you expressed of needing to see each individual. This, it seems to be a very universal value for the Jewish community. You know, we are called to see each person as being created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And for you to recognize that dignity and that divine spark in every single person is really meaningful. And Ruth, I know that you live this value every day when you approach parents and children. So I'm excited to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Naama. Yes, well, I guess as I was doing my work as a preschool educator from New Zealand, I became just astounded how many adults are walking around with their childhood so alive inside them. And as a survivor myself of sibling incest, and being here at the time of the feminist movement and sitting in groups with women and just realizing, I had really thought I was the only person in the world who had been violated and who was using the coping strategy of bulimia to allow me to function in some way. And as I sort of learned and connected with other women and men and then parenting, I began to realize there's something wrong. There's something incredibly wrong with the dominant, I call the dominant paradigm of how children are parented. And some of us come out well, and a lot of us don't. And how, childism
the oppression of children, the misuse of power over children, and its intersectionality with racism and poverty, classism, poverty, and disabled bodyism, and homophobia, with all the isms, really wreaks havoc. And as I learned more about the Convention for the Protection of Children's Rights, and really hearing what is happening to children around the world, in many, many countries, and visiting several countries, I realized how passionately I believe that it is the philosophy of nonviolence, breaking the cycle of violence, breaking the cycle of developmental trauma, generational trauma, historical trauma that gets landed on children's shoulders and becomes, they're the biggest silent minority in the world. And to me, this is a very powerful social justice issue, and one where I think that it's just not taken. It's just, we wait till there's abuse. We wait till there's, something that is devastating. We need to change right from the beginning. We need to stop the corporal punishment of children. We need to stop the humiliation and violation of children's hearts. And we need to really respect the convention and give every child the dignity of their human rights being acknowledged, respected, and honored. And that's child raising, whether it be in the home, in the school, in the juvenile justice system. And we've just got to stop the cycle.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Katie J., I am struck by the idea that this paradigm shift that Ruth talks about is something that you have seen and tried to achieve at scale, at the global level. Can you introduce us to a little bit of that work?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to thank Leslie, Genea, and Ruth for sharing your personal stories. I hold them in my heart, so I really appreciate you bringing that to the conversation this evening. IACT is an international humanitarian action organization. Our mission is to inspire a more mindful humanitarian world that really holds the dignity, humanity, the agency of mostly conflict-affected people. This is the community with whom we work, and to ensure that those things are recognized and affirmed and supported through humanitarian responses. Our model is both at an individual level, where we invest in individual and personal growth. It is programs that are led by refugees themselves. We do not leave international staff on the ground. And then it's that systems change that's really important. And I think the threads that everybody has sort of touched on the work of systems change and approaching trauma-informed care at a systems, at an organizational level. For us at IACT, that begins with listening. It begins with seeing the community that is in front of you. The current humanitarian system is broken. It hands out manuals, and it urges people from outside the community to come in and further take away choice. Genea, I think, really highlighted it when she said you have two choices when you're incarcerated. And refugee and displaced communities who have been affected by conflict, every choice that they've had has been taken away from them and is offered through an ID card. And that is your only access to choice. And if we look at what trauma is at a larger scale, trauma is something that's happened to you and that you did not choose. You did not have choice over the trauma that you feel in your body and that you experienced. And so part of the healing process is sort of taking back that choice. And as organizations like IACT who are working in humanitarian settings, you have an opportunity to return that choice through the programs that you're offering, the very programs that are supposed to be there in service of the community. And we're talking about basic community programs, food, shelter, education. IACT works specifically in early childhood education. I think Ruth can speak to the necessity to work with children before the age of 6. 90% of your brain is developed before that age. And so if you're not creating opportunities for them to play, for them to laugh, for them to have a responsive caregiver in their life, and be able to have choice in their curiosity, those are actual parts of your brain that are being developed that you will hold for the rest of your life. And so being able to provide that opportunity in that space, not only what we found when we started our early childhood education programs with refugee communities was that it had just as much impact on the caregivers as it had on the children themselves. By being able to really bring in compassionate listening, mindfulness, mindful movement, but really that choice and the choices that the teachers and the caregivers have over their everyday lives and the everyday program, but also restoring relationships in community, which is also something that Genea spoke to. And when Leslie speaks about intergenerational trauma, the opportunity to restore those relationships is breaking the cycle that Ruth is talking about. It's providing an opportunity for another pathway because trust has been rebuilt and community care is more centered than when you're stuck in a cycle of violence. And so really, when you're looking at trauma-informed approaches, yes, there are individual care options, but a community care model where for us, refugees who've been impacted by mass atrocities and conflict have that choice where folks who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated are able to choose what is in front of them, be able to choose a purpose-filled and a meaningful life. These are ways that structures and communities and organizations can support a trauma-informed approach to a world that has less violence in it.
Thank you, Katie J. I want to stay with this idea of choice for a second, because it strikes me, Leslie and Genea, both of you, and also Ruth, you as well, you had a moment of choice where you each decided to break this cycle that Ruth spoke about. Can you tell us do you mind telling us a little bit about that moment of clarity? Leslie, I don't know if you want to start off, or Genea, you first. I'm hoping this part of this will be more of a conversation, so
Sure.
jump on in.
Well, I'm happy to, I think I speak a lot about the Holocaust and its implications to the world today, to young people. And so, we talk to students in particular about choice. And one of the reasons my mother wanted to tell her story to begin with is she wanted to show that people could go through the worst experiences imaginable and not only survive, but survive well, go on to also have good things happen to them. I'm not sure that for me personally, I looked at it as a choice. When I was growing up, I wasn't really aware of the impact of intergenerational trauma. I think that I was lucky to have parents who believed I could accomplish whatever I wanted. And I think one of the sort of bright spots about trauma in the way I inherited it was that I had a sense from my first days that almost my birth was fortunate, that it could have gone either way, and that I was born into a very fractured world. So I had almost a sense of a deep responsibility to try to repair things, to try to make things better. And I think in trying to repair the world, I inadvertently repaired myself too.
That's wonderful. That's really a beautiful sentiment. Thank you. Genea, I'm thinking about not just your choice in this moment that you decided to be a light, but also what the process is for shepherding other women towards this moment and towards this choice. What is that like, and what are the challenges there? What's that experience?
Well, I have to say that first and foremost, any choice that I made to do any good came from God. So I'm sorry, but God gets all the glory in my life, because all good things come from God. So if it wasn't for him, then there would be no good in me. So I'm blessed to have parents that taught me about God, because he taught me how to care for others, how to see others. So it wasn't so much that I was cognizant that I was making a choice when I was incarcerated to help other people. That came later. It was just, I saw the brokenness, I saw the darkness, I saw that all these people that have suffered from trauma has been thrown in one place, and they just have to learn how to cope in there. So through living on my daily basis, I said to myself, I can just fall into this, or I can try to help people. And just like it, I just can't put emphasis on it enough that that was the most important factor in there, was seeing people. And I think that in society that we live in today, people walk over people and they don't see people. But I've noticed that when you notice someone, it helps them to heal because they have that connection. Someone noticed that I was down. Someone noticed that I may not have been feeling well today. And so when I was incarcerated, how I shared with the cup of coffee, like we live 8 women to 1 cell. And when someone comes in, you can easily be engaged in your headphones or in what you're doing. But if you notice that they come in and they might have gotten a phone call where a loved one died, or they feel helpless over raising their child, and you say, hey, would you like a cup of coffee? That's telling them, I see you, I know what you're feeling. And so I just saw that those things help the women, just simple things like that. So it's not nothing that I was doing on a daily basis other than loving people, other than seeing the value, seeing the treasure of a woman who has suffered all of these things. So in doing that, it helps you heal. I mean, it's a choice that you have to say, hey, I'm going to get up today and I'm going to try to see the good. I'm going to get up and I'm going to try to live despite my circumstances and know that I have a purpose in all of this. So that's just what I dedicate. I just live by that principle because, like I said, being in that taught me that that's the most important thing when it comes to healing, when it comes to trying to make the world better through one act of kindness. Yeah. So that's what I try to model out here, and I'm creating programs and curriculum to based on those truths, to implement those truths. So
thank you. Thank
Can
you.
Can I add one thing to what Genea, and then because I know Ruth and Katie J, I'm sure have comments to make about this too. But you know, there's something, Genea, in what you're saying that reminds me of an experience I see with my mother, which is so appreciate how you care about people and put acts of kindness out there. But it strikes me that I imagine that a key reason people are so attracted to you and you are healing is you make yourself vulnerable too in telling your story. And that's one of the things that I noticed that with my mother, when she puts her heart out there and reveals her past to a room full of students, however dissimilar her life was to the people she's talking to, the sadder the students' lives have been, they all want to stand in my mother's line afterward and give her a hug and tell her something about themselves. Like there is this common humanity in all of us that I feel like comes out in her telling her story, as we tell our own stories with the sad parts of them and the vulnerable parts of them. I think it brings out the best in other people and sort of ignites a healing process in other people as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's so important, this idea that we are reciprocal animals, human beings, and that when we give of ourselves, we are also able to inspire that gift in other people. I think that's so true, and so powerful, and such a way of creating community. And I think that community itself is really essential to healing. Ruth, that leads me to families, which are their own kind of mini communities. What are the implications of, trying to do this paradigm shift with families when so many adults were parented in a way that causes them to carry around their own trauma.
Yes, Janae, I really heard you, Janae, and I think what you're talking about, the values of kindness and being seen and belonging and being valued for who you are. I think that's what every human being longs for. And, that to me I have never met a parent who says to me, I'm intentionally not going to love my children well. I've never, I think every parent, longs to do the verb of loving, not just they all love, but to do that loving well. And so many of us, and, come and have from our own trauma, are not able to heal enough before we have children to really be able to do it. And I really want to move from looking at the individual trauma of individual women. I mean, just think about in the United States that 1 out of every 4 little girls is sexually abused before she's 18, and 1 out of 6 little boys. That statistic, by the way, has not changed in my lifetime. And if there's one thing that I find so passionately disturbing as somebody who was one of those children, and why aren't we solving that problem? Why are we continuing to have these just horrible statistics about sexual abuse in children? So I want to move from individual trauma, which has to be focused on, to the power of collective healing. Taking Sean Ginwright's words, healing-centered engagement, and creating in any parenting situation that I do, or in support group, or when I do professional trainings, people want to talk about their children, not really about their clients so much to begin with. But by creating community, by holding, I have a gesture called empathy hands, and just pausing, having everybody be able to tell their story, for many people to be listened to fully for the first time, to break the secrets, to be vulnerable, and to be held in these lovely empathy hands in a collective healing process. That, I believe, is what is the transition for many people away from closed up, shut down, suffering, to an open holding. And Katie, what you were talking about, Katie J, I'm sorry, what you were talking about, being able to be, to raise their children from a place of kindness, nurturing. We talk about this word attachment. It's so hard. And what most people do who practice dominant paradigm parenting, attach to their children when they're good, and when they're not so good, put them in timeout or humiliate them or threaten them with corporal punishment. So unconditionally, loving and attaching to children, that's what our little brains really want. And yet it's so hard. And so I'm a great believer in collective holding of parents.
I think that's so important. The sort of this idea of the collective positive good. I think so many of us think about the collective in trauma, right? Katie J, I think this applies to your work so much, but there is truly this community of healing that's so essential. I remember that when I was working in Democratic Republic of Congo, part of the challenge for women who were survivors of sexualized violence is that because of the violence they experienced, they were ostracized from their family. And in Congo, culturally, grief is something that you do communally. Grief is something you do with your entire family and your entire community. And being cut off from that family and being cut off from that community meant that they were cut off from a pathway of healing. So it was so essential to reestablish that community of healing And it's important to remember that that is true everywhere. That is true for all of our sort of holistic experience of healing. Katie J, I'd love to hear what you think, how this applies at the global and the humanitarian level.
I mean, I think what I'm hearing from the other community members who are on this panel is that we can't wait generations and generations to address the trauma that people feel. And I think when our organization and when other humanitarian organizations, but even in the system, in the incarceration system and the justice system in America, the structures itself are literally creating the opposite space than is conducive to healing. And so we really have to shake it up, and we have to look at it completely different. And when we're talking about community care, that means looking at a bottom-up model. So all of these top-down structures that hold power at the top and tell you what to do every day and give you access to only what each person in each area, in each zone in a camp, or each area or yard in a prison, these types of systems are actually perpetuating the trauma. They're not providing a space or an opportunity for community care. They're not providing a space for somebody to uncover the empowerment that has been buried, under whatever the traumatic experience they have, because the body and the response to trauma doesn't know what the actual event was, but it holds it in the same manner. This is why, like when Ruth is talking about how parents respond to children, I'm a parent, and sometimes I see myself just doing exactly what my mom did to me because it is what I know. And I have to I have to figure out a way in my own mind to pause myself, take the moment, and then change my response. And the only way that I'm able to do that is because I have a community of care, because I've set up structures and systems around me to be able to reinforce that moment of pause, that moment to redirect my reaction, to create a response instead of a reaction. And so the individual to community care is also about the institutions and the systems that we work within. If we continue to support top-down systems that do not engage the community in coming up with the response that will heal or create spaces of healing that is right for that community, then the trauma will perpetuate itself. And so really we, and for us, we work with communities who are affected by mass atrocity and genocide. That, I remember in 2012, we were with a community, Darfur refugee communities in Eastern Chad, and they had been in these camps. They're still in these camps. They're still in the camps in Eastern Chad. They started the camps in 2003, 2004. And in 2012, we were having a conversation. It was sports related. And, our founder, Gabriel Starring, asked, what would you like us to tell and share with the world? And there was a long silence, and the leader stood up and said, we want to tell you that you're the first person who's ever asked us that. So that was in 2012. And if they in that community had been in that camp since 2003 and nobody had asked them, nobody had seen their humanity, like Genea is saying, and Ruth and Leslie are saying, seeing someone and listening to them is honoring our common humanity. But our systems say detach. Our systems say, as humanitarian workers, don't get personally involved. Use this manual. Instead of, the guards and the prison yards are detached, right? So they're breaking that personal relationship. They're breaking the responsive relationship, the relational attunement that you can create with folks, which is the beginning of that process of healing, right? For both sides. It's both sides. There's mutual relationships that happen if you can change the structures and have the structures be more grounded in seeing each other's humanity. And what that looks like, people ask all the time, and it just starts with listening, really asking communities what they need. And then it's engaging them in the process of providing that solution to meet the community's needs. In our case, it's early child education and sports systems. In Genea's case, it's circles, it's providing the opportunity for reflection. But that comes from engaging the community and asking them what their needs are, and then having community members be the leaders, take the leadership role, and make the same mistakes that people in positions of power usually make. As an executive director, I make mistakes every day, right? Earlier this year, I deleted our whole Google Drive, of everything, right? I'm afforded that. Everybody else should be afforded to make mistakes as well. I've learned now how not to do that. But I think this idea that Westerners, in my case, in humanitarian aid, but also officials in the justice system, those who hold positions of power, they're right and they have the answer. And that power dynamic is really what is preventing us from creating systems built on healing. And so if we can shift the power to the community members, whatever community that is, community of children in a preschool center, right? Intergenerational group discussing how trauma has affected, incarcerated women, refugees fleeing, who have been displaced for either a protracted period or right now, the refugees who are fleeing from Artsakh into Armenia. So if we can be able to create immediately a response where there is opportunity and space for healing, for leadership, for choice and engagement, that will break this system that really holds in place a top-down system that prevents and is actually a barrier to moving forward and creating a more purposeful, driven future where people can thrive.
Yes, yes. Before we go to our Q&A, and please do put your questions in the Q&A box. I don't actually know how it works. You type it in there. I do, Leslie, I want to go back to you for a second, because it strikes me that the implication of not approaching trauma with a healing mindset and mindfully and creating programs with trauma sensitivity at their center, what we're risking is this intergenerational transmission of trauma that you identified. And I'm actually curious about how you identified that that's what you were experiencing, was this intergenerational trauma. Was there a piece of research? Was there a study that you read? Was it just fate? How'd you get there?
Yes, I will answer that question. I just want to say, I'm just putting this out there, we probably won't get to it today, but in talking about the needs of communities to come together to heal, I'm struck by, right before us right now with COVID-19, we are going to have years and years of trauma from the young people now who have been out of school, who are home with people who they normally get a break from by going to school, without good eyes on them from teachers. We're just going to be experiencing in our own communities so much more trauma. So I think we have to think about, as a community, how we are going to approach that when we come out from that. But in terms of how I recognized intergenerational trauma, I think at first it just felt that, my mother, my daughter, and I are all such strong, determined people who were so successful in so many of the things we set our minds to do. It seemed that it had to be, excuse me, more, couldn't be accidental that we all had this same gene that allowed us to be the one person, especially my daughter and me, who never wanted to go to a sleepover, who never wanted to go away to camp, who always wanted everyone at our house, who always thought our mothers would die if we didn't focus on them. There was something that was like just too unique compared to all the other kids we were around, that it wasn't related to something. And then as I wrote this book and did more research, I came across a lot of recent research related to this topic of intergenerational trauma. There's one researcher I particularly am enamored with, Rachel Yehuda, who has done a lot of the sort of seminal work on intergenerational trauma, intergenerational transmission of trauma. She's worked with 9/11 survivors. She's done animal research, but she's done a lot of work with Holocaust survivors, and found that that there are certain traits like cortisol levels she found to be lower in not only the first generation of Holocaust survivors, but the second generation of Holocaust survivors. And there have been studies of separating baby mice from their mother and track that 4 generations later, they still have epigenetic, as they call it, not necessarily forever changed DNA, but biological traits that are changed as a result of one generation's trauma. They have, for example, there have been research that has shown that that Civil War prisoners, that their children and grandchildren showed a much higher propensity toward obesity and being overweight from their grandparents having starved. Same, there have been studies with the Irish potato famine descendants. So but I think Rachel Yehuda has just been right on and very vigorous in her research on this topic, and would be most interesting probably for everybody to read.
So it's so interesting that you bring up the connection between trauma and obesity and other physical manifestations, because we actually have a question from a person who left the Central Highlands in Vietnam. And his wife is experiencing physical manifestations that they think may be linked to her actual trauma. And I'm wondering if, I know that when in my work in Democratic Republic of Congo, and actually in Jewish World Watch's work in Democratic Republic of Congo, we were introduced to this idea that women who were survivors of sexualized violence, you could repair their bodies completely perfectly, and they would just make the decision to let go of their lives, and they would waste away. They wouldn't physically, they wouldn't take their own lives, but they would just stop. And I wonder if any of you have seen or experienced that kind of physical manifestation of trauma, and how trauma is held in the body.
Definitely being incarcerated, you see that. The intergenerational trauma, you can see that incarcerated mothers, daughters, children, I've seen whole generations in there. So are just things that a woman was wake up and say she would lose the will to live. So yes, I've seen people waste away. I've seen people come in one way, and during their time of being incarcerated, they would not be themselves. They would just lose how they carry themselves, how they would talk, how would they care for themselves. You can physically see that in an environment like prison. And I just wanted to also emphasize when Katie J was talking about community, and not to bring us back, I'll make this real quick, because healing dialogue and action, the example of that is that people think that when you have become when a crime is committed, they say throw away the perpetrator. That's your justice. But they don't think about the scars and the trauma and the wounds that come with that. So no one reaches out to the community and says, hey, let me help you heal. You got your justice. That person is incarcerated. So with Healing Dialogue, we actually reach out to the community, and we offer services for people who have been victims of crime. And we also go back into the prisons, and we offer our services to people who are incarcerated. The ultimate goal is to bring them together on one platform to create a dialogue that expresses restorative justice and healing. And I've seen that firsthand, the power of bringing community together, how that helps heals, because it changes the perspective, and it creates an understanding, and it mends bridges for the community and incarcerated people to come together on one platform. So, and I have read Rachel Yehuda's article, actually. I just recently read it. So yes, I just wanted to say that, and I just seen the physical effects of what you're talking about incarcerated. So yes, that's true.
Thank you, Genea.
I think also along with Rachel's work, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is another really great resource. His leading book is The Body Keeps the Score, and it really goes through how the body holds trauma and how it can manifest not only into mental spaces, but also into very physical spaces. And he is a doctor. I'm going to leave it at that, because he will be able to explain it much better than I. So it's The Body Keeps the Score. And I'm sure John or Jeff will pop it into the chat box.
I think that, so often childhood trauma We think that, you know, especially for very young children, we think that it's actually, you know, well, they'll forget about it. But intrinsic memory, how early trauma is stored in the organs and the muscles and in the guts, you know, in our guts, and how we may not actually have the words to sort of tell the story, which we do when we're older. You know, children are 3, 4 up, you know, how important it is that we tell the stories. I'm a great believer in writing empathy books for children and holding their narratives. And what happens that so many of us are walking around with, you know, from just trauma trapped. I mean, what is eating disorders, you know? What are addictions? You know, what is horrible, what is violence, you know? It's all so much this, trapped trauma. And, you know, so many people now are finding healing. Van der Kolk talks a lot about the healing power of yoga, but the healing power of somatic therapies now that actually aren't just about verbalizing, but are actually about releasing. And I think that's just critical. It's critical that we acknowledge the trauma that is in the body. I mean, connections with diabetes, connections, look at the ACEs study, you know, that thank goodness we have a Surgeon General in California who is really honoring adverse childhood experiences and asking, you know, children to be screened, because we know she talked, Nadine Burke Harris talks a lot about when she was working with asthma and working with ADHD, that it was trauma that was trapped in children. So yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic and one
Yes.
passionately about. But if we don't start telling the truth, if we don't start talking, if we don't start, you know, publicly having a public consciousness about how we're raising our children, we won't end violence. We're not going to end the addiction. We're not going to break the cycles unless we begin to lift the veil of secrecy around how many children are being parented. And that is cross-generational trauma. You know, so if I'm going to change my parenting, I have to heal.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's just,
So,
yeah.
knowing that we only have a few minutes left, we did get a question that I very much want to get to, which is, how is it that we can get involved with each of your organizations and your work? So, jump on in. Who wants to start? Katie J, want to go? We'll go in reverse order.
Okay, great. Yes. So iact.ngo is our website. We are actually a pretty small paid staff and rely heavily on our volunteer team members. And we have different sub-teams that cover early childhood education, mindfulness, mindful movement, yoga practices, but the structure of our humanitarian responses, sports programs. So there's a volunteer tab, you know, button that you press and you fill it out, and then Danielle Kircher, our team and operations manager, will reach out and starts with a conversation and with listening to what skills you have and what you want to learn and what you want to share, and from there you're sort of welcomed into the IAC family, or some people say the IAC mafia, because once you're in, we never let you go.
Great, good, as it should be. Thank you, Katie J. Ruth, how can we get involved with your work?
Well, I'm a retired.
You don't do retirement well. I know you, and this is not true.
Meaning that I'm not part of an organization at this point. What I would say, I have a website, ruthbeaglehole.com. I have a new guide coming out on raising children with nonviolence that I hope will be able to be picked up by agencies who are really looking for a parenting program that really is shifting the paradigm. And I would say the way people could get involved in this work is you know, when you're out in public, you know, or when you can, Spread the words. Oh, here's an example of childism. You know, I wonder if I can figure out how to talk to the school, talk to teachers, you know, like carry it out into the public sphere.
Thank you. Genea, how do we get involved in healing dialogue and action and in your work?
Well, you can go to our website, healingdialogueandaction.org, and it has a lot of information on there. But I do want to put emphasis on what Ruth said as well, is simply by spreading your voice, seeing people in the community, finding out how to raise awareness just by speaking, talking about these things, having the conversations, things like this. We're spreading the word now. So simple acts of kindness, seeing people, using your voice, caring, and healingdialogueandaction.org, and there will be more information there. So
thank you so much, Genea. And in case you all haven't noticed, all of these links are being dropped in the chat, including, I hope, a link to Leslie, your book. And how else can we get involved in your work? What would you like people to take out of this conversation?
Well, I would love everyone to read my book. And I started a nonprofit. I was involved in starting a nonprofit 30 years ago called the Alliance for Children's Rights, where we get lawyers to represent at-risk children and foster youth in LA County. And we make good use of donations and volunteers, but trauma-informed care is a big part of the principle of our work there. And also I'm on the International Board of Human Rights Watch, and also trauma-informed work is at the center of so much of our work with Human Rights Watch too. So both of those organizations are very interesting work. The Alliance is local, Human Rights Watch is international, and but I really agree, first and foremost, that we could spread a spirit that we all really need to be the change we want to see in the world. And that is what I try to, allow. That's the connection between the Holocaust and the world today, is to say that people who made a difference in the Holocaust, the upstanders, were just ordinary people like you and me and all of us. And one day they decided to do something good. They decided that they would hide somebody in their house for a day or leave a bit of food out. And thousands of people survived, not because the government did the right thing, but because human beings in their hearts knew what was right and acted upon it. And so we all know there's going to be trauma from COVID. We all know there's trauma all around us, and we all have to be part of the healing process and not wait for others to do that.
Thank you so much. And, I do want to end on just on a quick note that one of the ways that all of us can get involved in building this community of healing is by staying engaged with and staying involved with Jewish World Watch, which has over more than a decade done a spectacular job of listening to communities that have experienced trauma and looking for systemic ways to heal that trauma and to end the system, to dismantle the system that allows genocide and mass atrocities to continue around the world. You have an opportunity to do just that this month. The Walk to End Genocide is ongoing, and I'm going to let Serena talk about this in a second because I'm not as good at it as I used to be when I was at Jewish World Watch, so she's going to do it in a second. But the Walk to End Genocide is incredibly powerful and meaningful, and it shows the United States and it shows our Jewish community and it shows the world that we see the people who are suffering around the world, and we hear that people are suffering around the world, and we as a community, we as a people will stand up against that. We are called to tikkun olam, and tikkun does not mean relief. It means repair. And repairing means finding a systemic level of change. And that is a level of change that Jewish World Watch has been committed to from its inception and continues this day. And I hope everybody will get engaged. The link to the Walk to End Genocide is in the chat. So please click on that link and get involved and stay involved with Jewish World Watch. And with that, I'll turn it to Serena to see if she has any last words.
Thanks so much, Naama. And thank you to all of you for being here tonight and for sharing your stories. I think there's so much we can take away from tonight, but foremost that healing cannot happen in a silo, that we need to have a comprehensive approach. Something that really struck me as you were all talking from your different apertures is this idea in Judaism that each person is a universe unto themselves, and only as we work to repair ourselves can we work to repair others. But I think it can also be said that as long as part of our community is broken, that none of us can fully be whole. So I just want to thank everybody for coming together tonight, for all of the work that you're doing in our respective communities, where they intersect and where they don't. And yes, this is part of a month called Impact in Action, which is when we're raising our collective voices to fight against genocide and mass atrocities. So you can go on jww.org /impact, and you can still participate in the Walk to End Genocide. Instead of walking one day, 6.2 miles, you can walk the whole month. Who doesn't want to do that? And, you know, look, this is a partnership with a lot of organizations and a lot of people, but in order for Jewish World Watch to continue to provide programming like this, we really need your support. So I would ask you to go on today, support our work, and we're going to continue to lift our voices, to fight genocide, to fight the aftermath of trauma, to fight mass atrocities. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your night.